The Vikings, seafaring Norse people from Scandinavia, have their absolute prime during the 9th and 10th century. At the time, they were not satisfied by simply raiding England, but they actually managed to build permanent settlements in the British Isle, defeating pre-existing English kingdoms. Their presence in England left great effects on the Middle Age history of the country. From now on, you'll see the story of the Vikings in England and how they changed it in a way that remained for a long time. In the year of 793, on the small island off the northeast coast of England called Lindisfarne, landed a group of foreign men. They raided a monastery on the island, looting valuable items like gold and religious artifacts, and destroyed the buildings there. The attack of the Holy Island gave a great shock to the local Anglo-Saxons, and was later marked as the start of the Viking Age. After the initial attacks, they kept on sending raiding parties to the shore of the British Isles for about 70 years, until they came up with a massive army called Great Heathen Army in 865, and also at this time with the intention of staying in England. The army was a combined force of Vikings from all over the places, from Norway, Denmark, Sweden, and some from out of Scandinavia. It was to avenge the tragic death of legendary Viking leader Ragnar Lothbrok, who was killed by an English king Aela. The army, which was led by 3 sons of Ragnar, was much bigger than the previous raiding parties. Their goal was to conquer 4 English kingdoms that existed then, the kingdoms of Northumbria, East Anglia, Mercia, and Wessex. The army landed in East Anglia, wintered there, and started attacking the 4 kingdoms as the spring came. They succeeded in conquering the part of Mercia and Northumbria and overthrew the king of East Anglia, replacing the throne with Danish king Guthrum. When the King Alfred of Wessex defeated Vikings trying to attack his territory, the Vikings and the English king finally came to have a peace treaty in 886. And the Scandinavian settlements of England, what's now called the Danelaw, were finally established. The settlement's population consisted of warriors and the immigrants from Scandinavia. Even though they were the conquerors, the local Anglo-Saxon were still the majority of the populations. The relationship between 2 different groups of people was not hostile. Instead, they did a pretty good job on coexisting, with Anglo-Saxons following the new Danish system, and the Vikings slowly embracing local cultures like Christianity. Viking immigrants gradually integrated with the local people, often through marriage, resulting in further blending of 2 cultures. The result of this also remains as a genetic heritage, with an average English person having about 9% of Scandinavian ancestry. One of the Viking incursion's major consequences was its impact on the English language. Sharing the similar Germanic background, the Old Norse and Old English were mutually comprehensible to some degree. A lot of existing English words were replaced by the words from Norse during Danelaw. Before the Vikings, the Old English had different third-person plural pronouns from as it is right now.
Here.
It was more like the inflection of third-person pronoun rather than having independent pronoun for plural use. The Vikings instead imported
Þeir,
of Old Norse, which was easier to be distinguished from other third-person pronouns. You can still find the pronoun close to this original form in modern Icelandic. There are also other everyday words that originated from the influx of Norse. Words like sky, egg, knife, window, lad, and die are some of the examples for that. And there are about 600 loanwords from Old Norse still remaining in English. Features of Viking tradition also remain in people's name. Instead of surnames as you know today, Vikings had a patronymic namings. First you have your given name, and then your father's name comes after, indicating whose son or daughter you are. For example, if your name is Halfdan Ragnarsson, you are Halfdan, the son of Ragnar. These namings settled into the naming convention we use right now as an unchanging surname, with some example being names like Eriksson, Haraldsson, Andersson, and so on. Another effect of Danelaw was the acceleration of urbanization in England. Scandinavia's hostile environment was not ideal for farming, and failure of crops was very common. This resulted in very small portions of Viking populations living in the rural area. Most of them lived in cities and towns relying on trades, craftsmanship, and raiding campaigns for living. This also contributed to the Vikings' eagerness to building settlement in more habitable and fertile land. When the Scandinavians came to England, they built cities that are considerably large for the standard of the time, and the nearby population started moving into a newly urbanized area. Before that, the English population was more evenly distributed, since there was no problem for living even if they just stayed in the countryside and ran a farm. Lots of cities grew and emerged during the period. Leicester, Nottingham, Derby, Stamford, and Lincoln were called as the Five Boroughs and became the main towns of England Midland. Even now, 4 out of these 5 cities are county towns with average populations being more than 260,000. York, the former capital of the Kingdom of Northumbria, was called Jorvik by Vikings and functioned as the center of the northern regions of Danelaw. Similarly, the East Anglian capital Norwich grew to be large under the control of Danish King Guthrum. You can easily find towns that originated from Scandinavian settlements by looking at their name, like the ones ending with B meaning village, and the ones ending with Thorf meaning farm. Not only in England, but also in Ireland, once a fortified base of Vikings grew to be a large city, which is now called Dublin. Since Vikings were great sailors and traders, these Scandinavian cities quickly became the hub of ocean trade routes. From these cities, they sailed to various parts of Europe and even farther east. They even reached the Mediterranean Sea and the trade routes connected to it, which are to the regions like Sicily, Byzantine Empire, Levant, and North Africa. In the north, they sailed on the Baltic Sea and the rivers connected to it. By Volga, they reached the Caspian Sea, and on the Dnipro, they reached the Black Sea. These connected the British Isle with the rest of the known world more than ever before. Vikings also brought their legal systems into their English territory. Their way of investigation and decision-making called Thing, which is an assembly where every free people could participate in, was performed in Danelaw regions functioning as the council and trial. There still is a town called Thingwall and many others with similar names, which means the place where the Thing was held. These customs later contributed to the system of juries in trial. Overall, Vikings had a well-established legal system even when seen from the perspective of these days. They had a precisely defined system of paying compensations for a specific crime. They also tried to rely on testimony and evidence when investigating a case, instead of taking account of God's intervention. Considering things like trial by ordeal that was common back in medieval Europe, where you get thrown into the water and you turn out to be guilty if you float, you can tell that this was a form of very advanced legal practices. Change in the military of English kingdoms happened during and after the Danelaw. English adopted some superior features of Viking armies and developed new systems to counter them. Scandinavian weaponry such as the two-handed Dane axe were introduced. They also started having nasal guards to their helmets as a result of the influence of Viking helmets. These changes of weapons can be found on tapestry depicting the Battle of Hastings, the battle that happened in 1066. Viking longships that allowed the effective raiding and combat of the Vikings were adapted by their navy, and Vikings also became a strong motivation for reinforcements of fortifications. They built fortified towns called burh, and coastal defenses was enhanced. The English army became more organized with more sturdy system under King Alfred and subsequent kings' effort of fighting the Scandinavian intruders. Danelaw ended with Eirik the Bloodaxe getting driven out of England in 954. And Vikings' presence in England diminished from history with the fall of Knut's Norse Empire. By nearly eliminating the 3 of 4 main kingdoms of England, Vikings contributed to the later unification of England under the power of Wessex. After the 11th century, Vikings' sphere influence started to shrink, facing their downfall. Even though the Danelaw lasted for a short period of time in history, its effect on England was something very significant.